Okay, hi everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So this week we're continuing our series of principled workshops. Last week we had a workshop that talks about how principled arguments fit into debating logic. This week what we're going to do instead is see some common example of principled arguments that you'll see cropping up a lot in debates so that you're ready for them when you see them coming up. In this workshop we're going to see two sections. The first, we're going to discuss some common non-utilitarian claims that you might see underlying lots of different principal arguments in debating. So these won't be applications of particular arguments, but rather themes that it's worth understanding because they're going to underlie lots of the applications we see later. In the second section then, we're going to go through a series of applications to various arguments that you will see quite concretely in debates and see how it is these themes arise and how you might deal with those arguments. To get started then, let's talk about some common non-utilitarian claims. The first of the non-utilitarian claims that I want to talk about is the claim that human beings are not merely a means to an end, but rather they are ends in of themselves. So this is kind of a common Kantian claim. It might not be clear at face value what it is exactly we mean by this, so I'm going to start by talking about two different intuition pumps, and then we'll give a bit more of a discussion about exactly what it is this claim means, and how it is that you might use it. So there are two common thought experiments that I think get used here, one of which, the second, I'm going to actually recommend you don't use in debates. So this is the thought experiment that goes by the title of the harmless rape. I don't want to give a full description of this thought experiment here. I think it's a little uncomfortable. In particular, the reason I don't want to recommend you use it in debates is I think that in its purest form, it borders the line of having some equity issues, and once you try to sanitize it to make that not the case, the thought experiment loses its power. If you want to hear a discussion of this thought experiment, there is one in Ashish Kumar's Principle Workshop online. You can also check out the original paper by John Gardner that gives this thought experiment by Googling it. But I don't want to discuss this thought experiment further here. Rather, what I'd like to talk about is the second intuition pump, or rather the first one on this slide, the one that I would recommend using in debates instead, and that is of organ harvesting. So, in this thought experiment, imagine that it's the case that, so I have a perfectly healthy set of organs, but I need some unrelated surgery. Say, I don't know, I badly injured, my arm or my hand, and I'm going to need to go for surgery for which they're going to want to put me under general anaesthetic. During that surgery, whilst I'm under general anaesthetic, it would be perfectly possible for the doctor to also take my kidney from me and transplant it into a patient who desperately needs a kidney in order to live and who otherwise wouldn't get one. Now, the harm to me from losing my kidney would probably, in terms of utility, not be that large in comparison to saving this person's life. I might be more at risk of medical issues later and so on, but I certainly wouldn't die from it, whilst this other patient, if they weren't to get that kidney, would presumably die. What that means is that, at least on the face of it, in terms of utility, the doctor harvesting that organ from me without my consent is a net positive in terms of utility. However, we do think that there is something deeply wrong about this situation in general. One of the things that you can use to describe why it is that this situation might be wrong is that when the doctor makes this decision without my consent, they treat my body as merely an object, something that they can borrow or take without my consent and use in order to reach positive utile outcomes. The problem is, though, my body isn't just an object. It is me and everything that I am. And therefore, when I am treated in this way, my most fundamental interests, the things that are most proximate to me, my rights over my body itself, which is everything I am, are mistreated. They are disrespected in a fundamentally wrong way, and therefore the doctor, we would say, uses me merely as a means to an end, where as a human being, as a moral agent, I am actually an end in of myself, and therefore you ought to treat me with more respect than that. Even though I don't know what goes on in this situation, even if you were to posit that upon waking up I would never even know that my kidney had been harvested, something wrong has happened there because the doctor has disrespected what my fundamental preferences about my own body are in order to increase utile outcomes. And this has lots of applications in debates. For example, you might talk about debates in conflict, in which one side is using human shields tactics as a very obvious application of this. There are various other applications as well. Secondly, in terms of common non-utilitarian claims, we want to talk about a series of claims in which one has special relationships or obligations to others that mean you ought to prioritize, therefore, those obligations. We're going to see broadly three sources of those obligations, starting with obligations that are generated by putting yourself in a position of vulnerability with respect to another person on the basis that you are going to trust them in that situation. So we're going to here reuse the intuition pump about organ harvesting, which shows that there are potentially multiple ways you can interpret this intuition pump, and say that one of the reasons then that this intuition pump might be wrong is that I have trusted that doctor when I allow them to put me under general anesthetic, to respect my interests, to treat me in a way that belies my vulnerability, that I'm allowing them myself to have with respect to them. And that if they were to betray that trust, then they would be doing me a wrong because they know that I've trusted them and made myself vulnerable, and that was only enabled by the assumption that they would, once I am in that vulnerable position, treat me well. I think this is a fairly intuitive claim. It does, though, have a series of applications in debating. The obvious one, for example, in lots of medical ethics debates, when you're making claims about how doctors ought to act in various situations, this kind of special relationship is applicable. The second, though, I think, is lots of debates about democracy or the state also might be applications of this special relationship, because we are all in a vulnerable position with respect to the state, and we are in that position, to some extent at least, because we trust that the state won't abuse that power with respect to us to exploit our vulnerability. Obviously, there are other reasons why we're in that position with respect to the state, but this is at least one of them. And therefore, you might say that this is one of the ways in which an obligation on the part of the state to treat its citizens at least vaguely well accrues. Secondly, and I think this is similar, but in a slightly nuanced way different, there are special relationships that one can say are generated by a situation of dependence. So I think this is made clearest via the intuition pump, so I'll give that first. Imagine that you are going for a walk by a lake. And for the sake of the thought experiment, I'm going to assume that for some reason, whenever you go for walks by lakes, you put on your favorite suit and watch, and they're very expensive. In that lake, you see a drowning man. There's no one else around, and the drowning man is screaming for help. I think everyone would agree, regardless of the cost of jumping in that lake to your suit, to your watch, and then for potentially to yourself, you do have an obligation to help that drowning man to try to save their life. In particular, you probably have a greater obligation than you would if you were on a crowded beach with hundreds of other people around. The reason then that this obligation acts so strongly upon you is you are not just in a position to help someone who is vulnerable, but you are in a unique position to help that person who is vulnerable. And what that means is if you allow the harm to accrue to them, you are uniquely responsible for those harms. Importantly, this is not a situation in which anyone put trust in you. You didn't consent to be the person walking by the lake when this man was drowning and calling to you for help. Rather than, I think this is a useful thought experiment to show that even situations you don't consent to can engender obligations upon you to take certain actions. The final kind of special relationship that I want to talk about is that of fulfilling promises. So again, this is, I think, similar to the mechanism about vulnerability or trust, but applies a little more generally and a little differently. Here, I just want to give a kind of analytic justification. When you make someone a promise, you set expectations for what they can expect from you in future. And those expectations inform how that person will act in future in order to maximize their own preferences. For example, if I promise someone that I'm going to meet them for lunch tomorrow, assuming we're not in COVID times, that might be a worse promise now, but in the before times, I promise I'm going to meet them for lunch tomorrow, and then I don't turn up. They might have turned up to that restaurant expecting to have a pleasant lunch with me, and instead they will either have to leave or eat alone. They've lost access to their preferences as a result. I think the important thing to notice here, though, is that I'm not just making the claim that the wrong of this situation is the kind of consequential one, that someone wasn't able to maximize their own preferences, and therefore we kind of saw a utility loss on average. Rather, I'm making the claim that regardless of what happens to me, I am doing that person a wrong knowingly by limiting their ability to exercise their own agency and meet their own preferences. And so even if that's something that's beneficial to me, that's not an acceptable excuse for me to do this because I'm doing a harm to someone else. And therefore, this promise engenders, again, some obligation upon me to act in a certain way to avoid doing those harms to other people. I do have one question that was sent to me in the Zoom chat, which is what exactly, so this is for the first on humans being an end to themselves. What exactly is so important about maintaining fundamental respect? So I guess this is a question about respecting people's most fundamental interests. I will say, I think that this is one of the points where obviously principal claims at some point have to reach the point where you're able to establish things via intuition pumps, because you have to at some point be able to take things as premises from which to be building your arguments. The point here then is that there are certain fundamental interests in how your own body is treated. That is, your own body is essentially everything that you are. It is the most proximate thing to you, and therefore you have absolute rights to define how it is that that body is used. It's not just an object, but rather it is you yourself. And that means you have the most fundamental interests in how it is treated. And when these interests that you have, for example, the interest in not having your organs harvested, are violated without your consent, then someone is not treating you as a human being, i.e. treating that body as a moral agent who is worthy of respect, but rather is treating you just as an object that they can use to derive utility. And that is something that is wrong for them to do. I think there's another question as well. A reminder in the meantime, Lucie has posted the form to sign up for the SPA if you haven't done already and you want to participate in that SPA later, then please go ahead and fill out that form. Jared, in answer to your question, I believe we're going to talk about choice later. So if I don't come back to this, or if you're not satisfied when we've talked about that, it would be good if you could ask that question again later, and we will cover that then. Cool. So Olga has asked me a slightly, there's lots of questions coming in. Some of these we might have to postpone to a Q&A at the end. I'm going to answer one more, and any others I'm going to ask you save for the Q&A at the end so we can get through the workshop. The final one that I got sent is, if I have fundamental rights to do whatever I want with my body, why can I not use that to walk away from the drowning person? I think this is a point that we made last week, but I will reiterate again. It might be that you have competing rights or obligations in debates. That is, it's not the case that everything we say in this workshop is part of some coherent and universally applied moral framework, because otherwise I assume the whole field of ethics would be a lot less active as an academic discipline right now. That means that obviously some of the things we say can be applied to argumentation in ways that conflict with each other. There are more questions. We're getting lots of them. I think lots of them are starting to become about examples. That's probably going to be best discussed, if anything, at the end of the workshop if we have time. So I'm going to instead move on, but please save those questions and we'll do our best to get back to them at the end. Two more common non-utilitarian claims that we want to talk about then. Firstly, the existence of reparatory duties. I think this is a very standard form of argument that you'll see in debates a lot, and as such, it has a standard structure that you have to complete in order to do it well. So first, to clarify, a reparatory duty, to give a thought experiment, is just one that gives, well, reparations or corrections for a wrong that was previously done. So for example, say Bob steals Alice's TV. Then Bob has done Alice a wrong, and we would agree then that Bob ought, or has an obligation to, one would even say a reparatory obligation, to return that TV to Alice. In debates, the way this is applied is often a little more complicated because it might be that the agent who did the wrong is someone who's long since dead, and that means that the obligation has to be passed down to the future, regardless though there is still a standard structure that one goes through in order to make the reparatory principle complete that you can apply in lots of debates. That standard structure is as follows. First, using an intuition pump like the one I gave, you establish that reparative obligations exist, that when wrongs are done, we ought to take action to correct them. Secondly, you establish that in the past, there has been some injustice that has happened that is akin to the thought experiment you've given. Thirdly, you might claim that that injustice still affects the present. That is, that the effects of that injustice are still being felt today. And finally, then, that the fact that this affects the present is something that creates continued culpability for which you can reach redress through the motion. So to give an example of that last step, what this might mean is that, for example, whilst I might not be the person who did the wrong in the past, I might still be the beneficiary of its effects. I might be still getting benefit from them. And that means that I might have an obligation, therefore, through the fact that I derive those benefits, to correct them. In particular, it's important in the last step that you actually establish that you are meeting exactly the reparative obligation. That is, often you have obligations to, in this case, to give back what is called the most commensurate good to the thing that was taken. I.e., if I steal Alice's TV, the thing I owe Alice back isn't £5. It's not even the cost of that TV. I owe her back the TV. Equally, then, in general reparative principles, the thing that you owe back to people is, okay, you can't always give back the TV. Maybe the TV was damaged, but you owe them back the closest thing possible. To give a thought experiment to illustrate this whole structure, or to extend the TV thought experiment, it might be the case, for example, that maybe Bob didn't steal Alice's TV, but rather Bob's father stole Alice's father's TV. And that TV, both of those parents are now dead and would have passed on that TV to their respective children. And that means that whilst Bob might not be the person who performed that past injustice, the injustice still affects the present because the TV is still in an unjust ownership, and Bob continues to derive benefits from watching that TV. If the motion was then, this House believes that Bob should give the TV to Alice, the reparative principle would say that the answer is yes, because the wrong that has been done that affects the present is that Alice doesn't have that TV and Bob benefits from the possession of it. And so he has a reparative duty to return that TV to Alice. Obviously, applications of this are on pretty much any motion that says the word reparations in the name. There are surprisingly many of them. We'll also see an application later where we apply this to talk about the obligations that a state might have to its citizens. The final thing I want to say then when talking about reparatory duties is just to give a common way of responding to them. I think there are actually two. Given that I've highlighted 5 steps to the argument about the existence of reparatory duties, obviously, if you notice any one of these 5 steps are done incompletely, that is a way to deal with the argument, because you can point out exactly where the assumption is made and why it's not demonstrated. That might then be sufficient in lots of debates. Assuming that, though, this structure is done correctly and the argument is connected, I think there is another way to deal with these kinds of reparatory principles. And that goes as follows. The problem with the thought experiment I give you is that it isolates the intuition that reparatory duties exist uniquely far too much. The assumption is that there was a kind of correct moral track that the world was on, and when the past injustice happened, we got set off from that moral track. And then, therefore, by correcting that injustice, we're going to get back on the world's correct moral track. The problem is that the world is messy. We're actually never on the correct moral track at all, and there are always many other injustices, many other problems that might engender on us other obligations that might be more important to us. So, for example, in a motion about paying, reparations to descendants of slaves, it might be the case that the reparatory obligation would say that we owe money to wealthy descendants of slaves. It might be, though, that we also have other obligations about how we use that money, to use that money to defend the vulnerable, to alleviate their situations, and so on. It could be then, like we said last week, that you can accept that the obligation entailed in this argument exists and say that there are more important competing obligations. Finally, on common non-utilitarian claims, I want to talk about the difference between experience and meaning. So those of you who were in the SPA debate last week will have kind of seen something similar to this intuition pump before, because we had a debate kind of themed around something that was definitely not the movie The Matrix, but very much like it. However, the thought experiment I want to give just to illustrate this first is what's called Nozick's experience machine. That is, imagine I have a machine that can perfectly simulate your ideal reality. I can plug you into it, and you will live in a dream world that to you, once you are inside, is indistinguishable in terms of sensory capacity, at least from reality. But you're going to be incredibly happy in that machine. You're going to get to live your dream life. The question is, ought you plug yourself into that machine, assuming that once you're in, you, of course, probably would never leave? Intuitively, the answer to that question might, for most people, I think, is no, that plugging yourself into that machine, whilst it might give you pleasure, it might give you utility, it's not actually giving you anything that's real and therefore meaningful. And therefore, you ought not plug yourself into that machine. The kind of analytic justification you can use in debates that underlies this intuition is that it says that happiness, just the pleasure or the utility you experience, isn't something that's valuable independent of context. It matters what kind of utility that is. If I just shoot you up full of heroin and that makes you in the short term very happy, even if that has no side effects, I do you a wrong, even though I am increasing utility for you to a very large degree. The reason is that utility is not valuable in of itself. It's a byproduct of valuable things. There are other things that we value, and when we experience them, we derive happiness. All of these things, happiness, these other more fundamental values, are only valuable in the circumstances in which human beings decide that they are. That is, that there is something fundamental about our agency as humans that assigns value to things when we will them to be valuable. The important result of this claim is that given that nothing is valuable unless the human will assigns it value, then it can never make sense to trade off the capacity to actually have that will, to exercise the ability to give things value and form preferences in order to gain utility, because you're trading off something that is more fundamentally valuable. And this might be, for example, one reason why you might not want to be plugged into the experience machine. Applications of this, for example, include protections of people's autonomy, especially, for example, their mental autonomy, their ability to form preferences, even if that's at the expense of losing utilitarian benefits. I want to highlight finally then two common responses to this that I think are potentially effective within debates. The first, and the one that I think is the one I use most commonly in rebuttal, is the claim that the kind of justification I give you above is actually an incomplete one, and it's actually very difficult to complete this justification. What the justification I gave above says is that utility isn't valuable on its own. It's only valuable when something else, the human will, gives it value. That doesn't mean that the human will on its own has any value either. It just means that the human will and utility, and the claim that that human will gives utility value, all taken together, is something that I ought to care about. That means that whilst the human will might be somewhat valuable, utility, when willed to be valuable, also might be somewhat valuable. This argument doesn't actually ever prove beyond the assertive level that the human will is of something of fundamental value that is therefore unacceptable for us to trade off. Despite that, though, I think you will see this argument a lot in debates, especially from people who've been watching various principle workshops online, and therefore see it as something that they can repeat. The final thing then I want to say is not necessarily merely a response, but also I think a common problem with the application of the above argument. That is, an assumption in the above argument is that the way we generate our preferences is something that happens somehow independent of the context around us. This is untrue. Obviously, the cultural context in which you live affects your preference formation. I like very different foods, for example, to ones I would like if I lived and had grown up in a different culture. The question then is, do we actually, in a meaningful sense, choose what we assign value to? Or is this something that is also determined largely by our environment and everyone else around us? In particular, are we wronged in various motions, when motions convince us that things are no longer of value or pressure us to believe that, given that this is probably no different than the pressure that society puts on us. So I think this is a common nuance in applications of this that you see in motions that's worth paying attention to. That's all of the kind of common non-utilitarian claims in this first section of the workshop. We're now going to move on to see some common examples of these arguments in debates. Given that we've had lots of questions already, and I think lots of them are starting to be about applications, maybe we'll save those questions for the end once we've seen the applications, and I'll hand over to Lucie, I believe, at this point to start talking about some common applications.
Cool. Just to clarify, I am audible and clear and loud. Great. Okay. In which case, I'm gonna start with the application. So we have, I think, couple, 3 or 4. So we're gonna start with democracy and justify democracy and how you can do it in debates using principles. So I think 2 ways that we're gonna talk about in which you can justify that democracy should be the way in which you are going to be choosing whichever outcome you want for what the state should be doing. The first one is in terms of preference aggregation. So the way we want to illustrate this is on, I think, a motion that's quite common, or like that can be in various versions said quite often. For example, this House believes that all decisions on an economic policy in times of crisis should be made by an independent panel of experts. So what government very often says in those debates is something like, look, there are some sort of technical, good utility maximizing decisions that this panel can make. People won't be able to make them because they don't know as much. Therefore, we should be giving the panel the power to make those decisions. If you are in that situation, it might be hard to try to defend democracy if government is able to say, we have a panel that just knows what's good. The way you can do it is to make the claim. I'm going to, again, illustrate on the motion to point out that in most cases, the decisions that are being made here are decisions that are fundamentally moral. For example, common decisions that this panel would be probably making in terms of economic crisis is, for example, deciding between austerity policies versus a stimulus policy. If you think about what this means, hopefully people know what they would entail, but I'm going to go into detail. If anything is unclear, just pop a question in the chat. It is not a question of just technicalities, but for example, if you pick a austerity measure, you probably are going to make the lives of people currently somewhat worse than on the comparative, because you are going to be cutting money that could go to social services, but it is very likely that the future generations for whom you're going to save that money are going to be comparatively better off. On the other hand, if you choose stimulus policies, you might be getting into a lot of debt, meaning that in the future, this might backfire and screw over the future generations. But the people who are living currently are going to be better off because you are giving them extra stuff that they can buy and spend, and all those things. Meaning that this is not a technical decision. This is a moral decision where we are effectively evaluating if we value the future generations, where there's maybe more people, over the current generations and over what the current people are suffering. Because of that, this is not something that can technically a panel just decide. No, you can do very similar things with like environmental policy or any kind of other policy that can be put in that sort of motion. Then you can just claim that there is absolutely no reason why that panel of experts has some sort of superior knowledge of what the correct moral decision is. Like the panel doesn't have extra like special moral arbitration. What this means is that democracy and the aggregation of preferences of individuals is the correct way that you can find what actually is valuable and what people value, because you find out through finding these preferences what the human will does assign the value to. Again, going back to what we talked about in terms of the argument about meaning and experience. So that's one way that you can try to counter or use justify democracy in a lot of these debates that ask you to justify democracy over some sort of technocratic, like some sort of technocracy. I think the second one, the procedural justification, again, can be used in those motions, but again, anymore, is using a reparatory principle. So we would go through the structure that is pretty much the one that Rhys already explained in how we generally do reparatory principles, and we would apply it on the state. So the first thing that we can establish is that the state is a coercive agent. For example, the state is making people pay taxes. The state, if I'm going to decide that I'm going to resist the state and I'm going to do something that the state doesn't want me to do, I'm going to break the law, they're going to send the police on me, they're going to arrest me, and they're going to like literally just like violently force me to oblige. This is also done against my consent, right? Because before I'm turn 18, I don't have the capacity to vote. But even if I'm 17 and I'm going to do something horrible, like some break law-y thingy, the state is still going to coerce me regardless. What it means is that against my consent, I am being coerced into, and the state is limiting my autonomy against my consent. What this means is that the state has done me wrong and done everyone wrong and has an obligation to restore it. I can point out that the state has this obligation equally to all its citizens. And what this means is that in order to restore the autonomy, the state has to do the best option to give everyone an equal say over its action. When this can be done through vote, because we have one man, one vote, meaning that everyone gets to express their preferences and is able to exercise the autonomy in how the state is going to be behaving, given that the state has previously taken the autonomy from you. So through that reparatory principle, you can again justify as to why the state needs to give people the chance to exercise the democratic right and vote, as opposed to, say, in motions where it would say that the state should just do something that sounds really utile, but it would be against the will of the citizens. So it would be something that the state would just unilaterally impose on the citizens without some sort of democratic discussion. Cool. I hope that's clear in terms of the democracy. Again, if there are any questions in terms of the application, just put them in the chat. We're going to do a Q&A at the end. If we can get next slide. Cool. So the next slide is about obligations of future generations. And this is something that comes in debates quite often. I think 2 weeks ago, we did have a SPAR debate that actually did touch on it quite a lot. In terms of, I think it was something about suspending environmental restrictions on companies during time of crisis. So there is a discussion about, do we care about current generations and the fact that they could technically get more money as a result of the companies being able to save money, or future generations because they're going to be screwed over by like the pollution. So there is very often in debates, there is a way up between, do we care about future generations more? Do we care about current generations more? Who we should be weighing in whose favor? So there is a couple ways that are useful in which you can try to claim that the obligations to future generations either don't exist or are significantly less important than the obligations that we have to current generations. I'm going to start with the one that is probably the least useful, but you can get away with it sometimes. So the first thing you can posit is that the nature of your obligations is preference dependent. So I need to know what the person I have more obligations to wants to evaluate what these obligations are. So for example, if I really, really like whiskey and I really love it and I would just drink it all the time, if someone forces me to drink a lot of whiskey, it is probably a less of a harm comparatively than if someone really, really hates whiskey and is being forced to drink a lot of it. So there is a difference based on the preferences of each of those individuals, even though like the act is the same. Because the people in the future do not yet exist and we have no idea what they want, we do not know their preferences. As a result, we do not have more obligations because we just can't tell what they want. We can't evaluate them. The response to this that is used quite often and often teams just can't react to it is just to point out that we probably can safely assume certain preferences, i.e. we probably these people are likely to want to survive. Which is why this is a claim that you can make, but you probably wouldn't be spending too much time on it because it's easily respondable to. Couple more that I think are probably a bit stronger. The second one is in terms of the nature of obligations being dependent on the character. So the intuition here is that the moral obligations that I have towards someone differ based on the moral character of the target of that obligation. So for example, I say there's someone who's like normal, nice, generally good person. I probably do have a set of obligations towards that person, whatever they are. I probably do not have the same obligations, or maybe not have obligations at all towards someone who's really awful. So like insert like any awful person you can imagine. Like if I probably do not have the same obligations to say like Hitler that I would have to someone who's a moral person who's behaving in accordance with like the general societal standards. Meaning that given that the future generations do not yet exist and we don't know what their character is, we do not have more obligations towards them because it's possible that just their characters are going to be in such a way that we do not have those obligations towards them. This is again a possible justification that you can give as to why you shouldn't have obligations to future generations. The third one, that is, I think, one of the ones that I like the most, and it's probably the hardest to respond to, and we're going to go through the responses. It's quite interesting. It's the one that's called the non-identity problem. So I'm really proud of the illustrations. Please, everyone appreciate it. So in terms of what the non-identity problem says. So basically, if you imagine that we are in the current world, say the world A, in which we are currently doing a lot of pollution. There's a lot of mean companies that are polluting, the air is getting bad. As a result of that pollution, in the future, there are going to be 3 kids that are going to be born that I called poison, Chernobyl, and toxicity. Now, the question is, do we have obligations towards these people to not to pollute? Because like they're going to be breathing badly because the air is going to be bad in the future they're going to be living in. The claim on non-identity problem is that, in fact, we are not making these people any worse off. The reason is the following. In world B, where we decide we're going to stop polluting, there's really nice, happy world, really green energy, all is good. In that world, the people who are going to be having kids and the people who are going to, like those having kids again and those having kids again, are going to probably make very different decisions as a result of that. So what it means is that far enough in the future, the kids that are going to be born are going to be different individuals than the ones that will be born in the polluting world. Instead of poison, Chernobyl, and toxicity, the kids that are going to be born are maybe going to be this rosy, hyacinth, and tulip. So what it means is that the kids in the first world, the poison and the other kids that are sad, are actually not harmed by pollution, because in the alternative world where pollution doesn't exist, these kids would not exist at all, because instead of them, the rosy and hyacinth and tulip would be born instead. What this means is that we can't claim that poison and Chernobyl and toxicity are worse off, because the alternative for those kids is that they wouldn't be existing at all. If you are assuming, and that's a thing that you have to accept unless you want to run some like anti-natalist weird stuff, that the life will be still like worth living, you can't claim they are being harmed because they are not worse off. The alternative for them would be not existing at all. I know this might be a little bit difficult, so if anyone is not clear about this, before we move on to the responses, because they are also somewhat hard, you can pop a message in the chat just so I can clarify before we go on. Cool. If there's nothing, then yeah, I'm gonna feel nice that you understood it. Cool. Can we have next slide? Yeah. So I think we want to do this together and kind of go through the objections and objections back, just so it's clear for you what the objections are. So I'm just going to get Rhys to explain some of the objections.
Yeah. So in the interest of clarity, I hate the conclusion of the non-identity problem, and everything you hear from me is going to be a response to that conclusion. Everything you hear from Lucie is going to be a defense of it. So first objection to the non-identity problem. One of the things that you can claim is that the obligations you have in various circumstances aren't necessarily to individual people, but rather you can just be a cold, hard utilitarian and say that the duty you have is actually to try to maximize the total amount of utility. That is the kind of average happiness in the world. And therefore, whilst it might be the case that different people live in either world, you have the obligation to create the world that has in it the most average happiness. And as a result, it's very clear that we ought to prefer to try to get into world B with Rosie, Hyacinth, and Tulip, because that's going to be the happier of the two worlds.
Cool. So the response you can give to it is to point out that if we do buy that, i.e. in all situations, we should just be maximizing total utility, and it doesn't matter how many people it's divided for and like who exactly it is for, you can arrive to some kind of bad conclusions. So a very common one is called the repugnant conclusion. So what this means is if I am buying what Rhys just said, then if I am given two choices, one is a world where there is 100,000 people who all live really, really good and happy lives. So all of them are really happy. They have abundance of everything. They have incredible lives. The second world will be a world where there's going to be 5 billion people, but all of them will be living just a little bit above the level on which life is worth living. If I'm comparing these two worlds, the second world, where the people are just about surviving and it's like just about good, has technically more utility because there's so many people that in total there's more utility and more happiness. But for most people, intuitively, they would rather want to have the world where there's less people, but everyone's really happy, and it just feels intuitively as the world that you would want to live in. Meaning that if Rhys wants to give that response, they also need to accept that conclusion and claim that that conclusion for them is acceptable. And obviously you can take it to like massive extents and make it sound really, really bad and very hard for them to defend. Yeah.
But whilst I'm kind of role-playing as a cold hard utilitarian, I think there is a defense you can make of the so-called repugnant conclusion. Even if I'm willing to assume that that thought experiment is possible, I can challenge the claim that the intuition we have about it is an accurate one. That is, I'm going to claim that the only reason you have that intuition in this situation is because of a cognitive bias that you have, a kind of flaw in your reasoning that leads your intuition to lead you astray. And that flaw is kind of twofold. One, I think humans are inherently very bad at conceptualizing things on a large scale. We don't have a really big or clear picture of the difference between, say, 1,000 people and 1,000,000 in our head, other than that we know 1,000,000 is a bigger number than 1,000. We can't really comprehend the differences in scale between these two things. That means we undervalue intuitively the small amounts of happiness accumulating to large amounts of people, because we just can't conceptualize properly of the things existing on that larger scale. Secondly, though, we do have a bias towards also positions that maximize individual happiness. And the reason is that when we try to evaluate those positions, what we do is we imagine how we would feel as kind of empathetic creatures. That's our natural response if we were the person accumulating that happiness. And that's how we evaluate that, how good that thing is. And what that means is that's something that actually feels more tangible, more proximate to us. Because whilst I can't conceptualize of how little bits of happiness for 1,000,000 people feel, because all I can think of is that little bit of happiness, and I can't conceive of the 1,000,000 people very well, I can conceive of what it would feel like to live that very happy life myself, because that's something I can imagine myself in. It feels therefore more tangible and more real to me. And that means that, right, I have this intuition that maybe says that one of those worlds is better than the other, but that might be a misleading intuition because it's based on some of the inabilities we have or biases we have in processing, misleading us from the conclusion. Having said that, I think we're ready to move on then to the second kind of criticism of the non-identity problem that we're going to give you. And that's what's called the type/token distinction. The way this argument works is as follows. So the claim in the non-identity problem is that there is no particular individual to whom I can owe an obligation, because there's no one who's harmed on comparative, because the comparative for all of them is non-existence. However, it might be the case instead that I don't just owe obligations to individuals, but rather I owe obligations to whoever fulfills, for example, a certain role. So that would be whoever satisfies a certain category or type. To give you a thought experiment that I think makes this somewhat intuitive, we as a society tend to think that parents have obligations to only have children if they are able to raise them in a reasonable situation. However, at the point where they make the decision to have a child, there is no particular child that they're going to have. The decision that they are making is affected by the non-identity problem, because the comparative for any of these children is non-existent. Regardless, we have the intuition that that parent owes their future child some obligation to give them a minimum standard of life. That is, what we believe then is that the obligations don't arrive to whatever particular child that parent might have, but rather they arise to whoever it is that fills the role of that parent's child, or in the case of future generations, that obligation might arise to whichever individuals happen to fill the role in future of that future generation. And therefore, whilst we might not owe obligations to them as individuals, we do owe obligations to the type as a whole.
So again, there is a response through a thought experiment. So the claim made is that we have an obligation to make whoever fulfills the category better off than whoever will fill the category on the opposite side. So the thought experiment is in terms of adoption and like in the trend of having a kid. So say I am someone who wants to adopt a child. So whoever I adopt is going to fulfill the category my child, that I should have the obligation to make as well off as possible. Now, assume that I have a choice between adopting a child that is sighted and adopting a child that is blind. Now, if I adopt the child that is blind, technically, whoever fulfills the category of my child is going to be worse off, assuming that we would claim that the life being blind is harder, than whoever would fulfill the category my child if I adopt the sighted one. So in the claim about type token distinction, it would mean that I am doing something morally wrong by adopting the blind child than if I adopt the sighted child. Obviously, intuitively, this doesn't sound correct, and it just sounds like there should be some sort of distinction, and there is no such obligation to just a type. So if someone does bring up the type token distinction, you can give thought experiment like this to like again inform the judges that maybe that's not the intuition and it doesn't work in most cases, and you actually do have obligations to specific individuals and making specific individuals worse off.
Yeah. I want to finish this criticism by just being clear on, I think, what the outcome of all of this argumentation is when you get to the end of it. The outcome of this argumentation is that whilst we have said the type token distinction is something that might apply, it's also intuitively not something that applies in all instances, and it is a difficult problem to work out where it does apply. As far as I'm aware, that's also a vastly unsettled problem. And what that means is if you case file this argument to its complete depth, you're not going to reach a powerful conclusion that will be settled within the debate. Having said that, then, one final criticism of the non-identity problem. And that criticism is the claim that, so to be clear, the identity problem says that the reason that I can't be wronging someone when I'm in this kind of future generation instance is that it is impossible to do to them a comparative harm. That is, that I can't make them worse off than they would otherwise have been because the comparative for them is non-existence. A possible response to this is to make the claim that it is possible to wrong or to harm someone in a kind of non-comparative sense, that is, without making them worse off. So to make this clear, I want to give a thought experiment. And that thought experiment goes as follows. Imagine that I am on a boat trip, and Lucie, for some reason, has decided that she really hates me that particular day and wants me dead, and she throws me off the boat. However, an hour later, that boat sinks. What that means is that my death in that, or actually I should say rather than an hour, possibly even minutes later, without Lucie's knowledge, that boat sinks. What that means in that circumstance is that in terms of consequences, in terms of what the comparative outcomes are for me, I'm not really worse off. I would have been on a boat that would have sunk anyway. I would have drowned anyway. So Lucie throwing me in the sea hasn't actually made me comparatively worse off. It hasn't done me a comparative harm. However, it is still something that we intuitively think it would be wrong to do. It would be a harm that was done to me at the intuitive level. And this suggests then that it is possible to do harms to people without making them comparatively worse off.
Yeah, so I think possible responses that you can have, one, specific with that thought experiment. And most thought experiments that people do give to illustrate that that specific response go around the same. So the way we can respond is to point out that the non-identity problem and the thought experiment that we just gave are not analogous. The reason for this is because when I threw Rhys out of the boat, had no idea that the boat is going to sink later. I.e., we can say that what the thought experiment proves is that it is wrong for me that I intended to make Rhys worse off, rather than in the case of the non-identity problem, where I know that the people are not going to be the same, and I'm not intending to make anyone worse off. I am, in fact, just not harming anyone with the full knowledge. So the problem with the thought experiment we just gave is my intention to make them worse off because I did not know that, in fact, the boat is not going to sink. So this is a way you can just point out to the judge that the intuition might just be coming from a different thing. The second claim is it is actually not necessarily clear that the non-comparative harm is actually a harm. I.e., there is probably a discussion that you can have in terms of what the metaphysics of harm is, and we can just question whether something that doesn't make anyone worse off, in fact, is a harm. There's obviously a philosophical discussion on it, so you can just question that altogether. Two, it's just unclear, just from this, even if we accept that maybe non-comparative harm is possible, it is unclear when it occurs and whether it actually applies to the non-identity problem. So there's ways to deal with that non-comparative harm response as well. So all of these things tend to boil down to what extent you are able to case file the responses to responses and responses back. So most of these objections, if people didn't hear about the argument, they might have trouble to just respond to you back. Especially in 7 minutes where they're going to be under stress, and you might just get away with it. Again, we try to give you as many layers and responses back as possible. So if you ever are in a situation where there is a good discussion on the future generations obligation, you are able to make your arguments as robust as possible. So broadly, that is that. I think for the last part, I'm going to give it back to Rhys again.
Yeah, so to finish up before we go to a Q&A, we're going to discuss two more kinds of common applications of the non-utile claims we saw earlier. The first are applications in choice. So I want to start this with a discussion about what the value of choice is in debates. To some degree, obviously earlier, we had a discussion about the value of the human will, the ability to form your own preferences. I want to point out that there is a subtle and often, I think, unappreciated difference between this argument and the one that just says that you ought to be able to make as many choices in terms of actually acting in the real world as possible. That is, the thing that I am valuing when I am valuing the human will is the ability to form preferences. It is not necessary that I can act them out in the real world. I just have to be able to think them in my kind of internal self. What that means is, despite what lots of teams will say when they try to conflate the two things based on the fact that the human will and free choice sound similar, there is a difference here, and we are left with the question of what value is there in choice in of itself. The thing I want to say about this is that debaters will often suggest that choice and the ability to choose between options is something that's inherently valuable. I'm yet to hear, I think, a particularly good justification for why that doesn't boil down to it being a proxy for the maximization of your preferences. That is, having lots of choices is good because it's going to allow you to choose the thing that best realizes your own preferences in the real world, which is ultimately a utilitarian claim. Now, of course, a utilitarian probably would reach this conclusion because the best arbiter of someone's preferences is that person themselves. And so maybe the best way for us to be able to realize those preferences in the world is to give people choice. I just want to give an intuition pump, though, that illustrates an interaction in debates that I think often happens that potentially limits the capacity of this argument. That is, often in debates, it might be the case that one side gives more choice, but it's not clear that this, when there are multiple benches in the debate giving different sets of choices, actually leads to the most preference maximization. That is, consider the following two situations. One in which I offer you £100 as a gift, but you get no choice there. In another, I offer you the choice between two gifts, and you know what they are. One is £10 and the other is £20. Or maybe even they're not different amounts of money, like £10 in a red lollipop and £10 in a yellow lollipop. Obviously, in the second instance, I have given you more choice, and therefore, within the context of that instance, you can maximize your preferences. Maybe you prefer red lollipops to yellow lollipops, and you would pick that option. However, unless for some reason you had a really strange idea about the value of lollipops, you would probably say that the other instance, the one in which I just give you £100 and no choice, is actually a better actualization of your preferences. And intuitively, we would rather live in that world. What that means is if you are able to establish that choice is actually only valuable because it allows you to maximize your preferences, then this often means in motions that choice questions about who gives the most choice actually collapse down to the kind of utilitarian question of which side of the debate gives people the better outcomes in terms of their preferences. I.e., you might be on the side of the debate that gives people less choice, but you're also the side that gives them the £100 gift. And therefore you're winning because that preference is actually the universal one in some sense. And the maxim underlying this, I guess, is the one that you are not really making a truly free choice that can maximize your preferences unless you're making a choice about the situation in which you make that choice also. And between the two sides of the motion then are various situations in which you could make that choice. Moving on to the last example that we want to talk about, and this is about property rights and redistributive justice, so things like progressive taxation. Firstly, I want to give two different justifications for property rights. I want to flag at the start of this, obviously, given that the debating circuit has certain political leanings, these are somewhat difficult arguments to convince debaters of. I do think there are justifications you can give for them, though. I'm going to suggest two. One is a kind of consequentialist justification that goes under the headline of Pareto improvement. That's a complicated wording for something that I think is quite simple, actually. That is, property rights are useful because they make, the claim at least goes, some people better off whilst making no one worse off. That is, by allowing ourselves property rights and by respecting them, we allow ourselves a situation where people are encouraged to produce, where they feel safe in their ability to take certain actions, and so on. And whilst that might create inequality, it also raises the general state of society, such that even the people who suffer the most from that inequality are better off than they otherwise, or at least not worse off than they otherwise would have been, while some people are better off. And so this is what's called a Pareto improvement. And therefore, consequentially speaking, you might see this as a good thing to enshrine as a rule. And therefore, you might reach a conclusion that property rights are something that are valid on a consequential basis. There is a second justification for consequential rights, a kind of Lockean justification that is non-consequentialist, and that is the claim, stemming from the claims we had earlier about the entitlement you have to your own body, that you also have entitlement to the outcomes of the applications of your own body. That is, that when you add value in some sense to things by using your body, then that value is also something to which you have an entitlement because it comes from your body. And therefore, the rights you have to your body transfer to it. And that means that when you, for example, improve the value of things, you have a property right type claim to them. I want to finish then by giving some responses to these claims, which I think is one of the more common applications, and also talking a little bit about an application of preparatory duties to talk about kind of redistribution. So one response, I think, to the non-consequential version of this claim, because I think everyone will be quite good at discussing the consequential version, is that individuals are not actually deserving of the property, even though they applied their own body to it, because they were only able to make that application based on something that was in of itself unjust. That is, the only reason that, for example, I am able to add value to certain kinds of property in any way is based on properties that arbitrarily came to me. The fact that, for example, I'm here giving this workshop is the result of various privileges I accrued, not by nature of anything about me, but rather where I was born. I achieved it as a result, essentially, of the lottery of birth. That was something that was arbitrary. I did nothing to earn it. And the fact that other people couldn't earn the same thing is something that was essentially unjust. that there is no reason that they ought not be able to gain those things. And that means then that I am not entitled to the benefits of those things because I gained them through an unjust situation in the first place. What that means is that redistribution is justifiable because it's correction for a situation that itself was initially unjust. There is a question here, which is, why is something being arbitrary necessarily bad? I don't think that's the claim I'm making. And I agree. So for those of you who are old enough, there are debates in which this claim is dealt with quite well, pointing out that things being morally arbitrary doesn't necessarily mean that they are morally incorrect. I think the situation you're saying here, though, is that there is inherent injustice in the unequal distribution of things like skills or privileges at birth, and that there was no morally significant reason that those privileges ought to have been distributed the way they were. That's the lottery of birth argument. And therefore, the initial situation from which all of the entitlement above stems was itself unjust. So it can't be that I have a right to property that follows from the fact that I, at birth, had certain privileges and skills, because the fact that I had those skills was in of itself following from an unjust situation, and therefore I can't make moral claims that are correct resulting from it. Hopefully that clears up the question. The final thing then to say is, what is the justification you should give for actually redistribution? I.e., how is it that you should make positive arguments that we do have duties to redistribute things and identify how it is we should redistribute them? So, for example, to justify progressive taxation policies where we tax more according as your income, for example, or your wealth increases. The usual way to do this is based on the intuition I just gave about property being derived from unjust situations in the past, is to claim then that the derivation of this property, the fact that people got this property from that unjust situation, was in of itself a wrong. And at that point, we can apply the reparatory principle we talked about earlier. There was an unjust enrichment. The fact that that enrichment happened did some degree of harm to me, assuming that I've dealt with the consequential justification for property rights. And therefore, there is a need to restore a principle and reparatory obligation to restore the losses I made because of that unjust situation to me. And therefore, for example, we might want to have a progressive taxation policy that takes the unjust gains of the wealthy and redistributes them to those who are the most vulnerable, those who have lost out most by that kind of unjust lottery of birth. Hopefully, everything on this slide is clear. We did promise a Q&A, so we're going to move to that now. If you have any questions about this slide or any other questions from the workshop, I'd be happy to try to answer those now. I do believe there was a question earlier I promised to come back to, so let me scroll back up to that. Yeah, so the question was as follows. For reparatory arguments, if you hurt someone, is a reparatory duty always created? What if, for example, that hurt makes the world a more moral place overall? So, for example, if the police take money from someone who is innocent, that would create a reparatory duty towards the innocent person. But if they take that from a criminal who'd gained that money unjustly, you'd see that as a moral action. So what's the difference in why we would see a reparatory duty in one case rather than the other? I think there are two comments I would make about this. The first is that there is a difference between hurting someone and doing a wrong. That is, and I think that is the pertinent one in the thought experiment that's given in this question. That is, in the reparatory principle, it's not just that someone has to be hurt in kind of the utilitarian sense where you're just unhappy, for example, as a result of some action, but rather you have to be wronged by it. The action had to be immoral towards you in the first place. And what that means in the second instance, where the police take that money back from the criminal, in fact, where they might themselves already be following the reparatory principle to restore it to the victim in some sense, a wrong isn't being done because they are acting in a morally correct way, and therefore the reparatory principle doesn't apply. However, in the first instance, where you are taking money from someone who is innocent, then you presumably are doing that person a wrong, because there is no reason why you should be stripping that money from them, assuming, of course, that I subscribe to some idea of property rights and don't think the police are just going to give that to someone who needs it more. The second comment I'd make that doesn't apply so much to the thought experiment, but it's a comment in general that is useful to keep in mind, and one we made earlier. It might be that you do a wrong that ultimately allows you to act in a way that makes the world a more moral place. For example, you might ignore the reparatory principle and act according to some other obligation instead. Even then, I think the situation is that reparatory duties can exist, and you can have more proximate or more important duties that you have to obey. So another way that you can answer this kind of objection is to remember that other obligations can in fact be more important. I don't see any other questions in the chat. If you do have any, please type them there and I'll come to answer them, or feel free to unmute yourself. Otherwise, Lucie, can I ask, are we nearly ready to go with the draw?